The sandy beach and a freshwater river coming off the Iceland totally absorbed the interest of the children. So Sandra and I were able to continue our talk uninterrupted. Perhaps it doesn't take too much imagination to envision the level of understanding and trust we were able to reach by spending at least 2 hours a day every day for a full years in deep communication. At the very first of the year, we talk about all kind of interesting topic, people ideas, events, the children, my writing, our family at home, future plans, and so forth. But little by little, our communication depend and we begin to talk more and more about our internal worlds, about our upbringing, our scripting, our feelings, and self doubt. As we were deeply immersed in these communication, we also observe them and observe ourselves in them. We begin to use that space between stimulus and response in some new and interesting ways, which cause us to think about how we were programmed and how those programs shape how we saw the world. We begin an exciting we begin an exciting adventures into our interior world and found it to be more exciting, more fascinating, more absorbing, more compelling, more filled with discovery and insight than anything we even knew in the outside world. It wasn't all sweetness and light. We occasionally hit some raw nerve and had some painful experiences, embarrassing experiences, self revealing experiences, experiences that made us extremely open and vulnerable to each other, and yet we found we had been wanting to go into those things for years. When we did go into the deeper, more tender issues and then came out of them, we felt in some way healed. We were so initially supportive and helpful, so encouraging and empathic to each other that we mature and facilitated these internal discoveries in each other. We gradually involved two spoken ground rules. The first was no probing as soon as we unfold the minor layer of vulnerability. We were not to question each other, only to empathize. Probing was simply too invasive. It was also too controlling and too logical. We were converting new difficult terrain that was scary and uncertain, and it stripped up fears and doubts. We wanted to cover more and more of it, but we grew the respect, that the need to let each other open up in our own time. The second ground rules was that when it hurt too much, when it was painful, we would simply quit for the day. Then we would either begin the next day where we left off or wait until the person who was sharing felt ready to continue. We carried around the loose and knowing that we wanted to deal with them, but because we had the time and the environment conducive to it, and because we were so excited to absorb our own involvement and to grow within our marriage, we simply knew that sooner or later we would deal with all those loose ends and bring them to some kind of closure. The most difficult and eventually the most fruitful part of this kind of communication came from my vulnerability and Sandra vulnerability touch. Then, because of our subjective involvement, we found that the space between stimulus and response was no longer there. A few bad feelings surfaced, but our deep desire and our implicit agreement and was to prepare ourselves to start where we left off, and deal with those feelings until we resolve them. One of those difficult times had to do with a basic tendency in my personality. My father was a very private individual, very controlled and very careful. My mother was and is a very public, very open, very spontaneous. I find both set of tendencies in me, and when I feel insecure, I tend to become private like my father. I like inside myself and safely observe. Sandra is more like my mother and social, authentic, and spontaneous. We had gone through many experiences over the years in which I felt her openness was inappropriate and she felt my constraint was dysfunctional both socially and to me as an individual because I would become insensitive to the feeling of other. All of this and much more came out during those deep visits. I came to value Sandra's insight and wisdom and the way she helped me to be a more open, giving, sensitive, and social person. Another of those difficult times had to do with what I perceived to be a hang up Sandra had, which had bothered me for years. She seems to have an obsession about Frigidare applicants, which I was at an absolute loss of to understand. She would not even consider buying another brand of appliances even when we were just starting out and on a very tight budget. She insisted that we drive the 50 miles to the big city where Frigidaire appliances were sold simply because no dealer in our small university town carried them at that time. This was a matter of considerable agitation to me. Fortunately, the situation came up only when we purchased an appliances, but when it did came up, it was like a stimulus that trigger of a hot button response. The single issue seems to be symbolic of all irrational thinking, and it generated a whole range of negative feelings within me. I usually resorted to my dysfunctional private behavior. I suppose I figured that the only way I could deal with it was not to deal with it. Otherwise, I felt I would lose control and say things I shouldn't say. There were times when I did slip and say something negative, and I had to go back and apologize. What bothered me the most was not that she liked Frasier, but that she persisted in making what I considered utterly illogical and indefensible statement to defend Frigidaire, which had no basis in fact whatsoever. If she had only agreed that her response were irrational and purely emotional, I think I could have handled it, but her justification was upsetting. It was sometimes in early spring when the Frigidaire issue came up. All our peer communication had prepared us. The ground rules had been deployed, deeply established, not to probe and to leave it alone if it got to be too painful for either or both. I will never forget the day we talked it through. We didn't end up on the beach that day. We just continued to ride through the Cana field, perhaps because we didn't want to look each other in the eye. There had been so much psychic history and so many bad feelings associated with the issue. It had been submerged for so long. It had never been so critical to rupture the relationship, but when you are trying to cultivate a beautiful, unified relationship, any divisive issues is important. Sandra and I were amazed At what we learned through the interaction, it was truly synergistic. It was as if Sandra was learning almost for the first time herself the reason for her so-called hang-up. She started to talk about her father, about how he had worked as a high school teacher and coach for years and how to help make ends meet. He had gone into the appliances business during an economic downturn. He had experienced serious financial difficulties, and the only thing that enabled him to stay in business during that time was the fact that Frigidaire would finance his inventory.